Hey, good people, it's Sammy Ashe, the Executive Director of the Ashe Academy, and your host of our Inspire, Uplift, Engage podcast. This week we're highlighting Tech by Choice, a nonprofit aimed at increasing diversity in the STEAM industry by offering low to no cost skill building events and workshops, helping individuals and protected groups, that's people of color, women, LGBTQ, and differently abled individuals, making sure they enter, stay, and thrive in the workplace. They pair technologists up with minority owned businesses to improve or create their online experiences. So if you want to get involved and check out their website, it's www.techbychoice.org. That's www.techbychoice.org. And of course, tell them we sent you. Now let's get started with the show. All right, welcome back to the Ashe Academy's Inspire, Uplift, Engage podcast. Thank you guys for joining us once again. I'm Sammy Ashe, the Executive Director of the Ashe Academy, your host. And we're joined by some very interesting people today. So starting out with our panel, Naeema Jamilah Torres. She's a Chicago area filmmaker who aims to tell stories unpacking notions of womanhood, complex ethnic identities and legacies in the Americas, and producing a short film and audio project about the legacy of an old slave house in Southern Illinois. So welcome. And then we have Ranier Maningding, founder of LLAG Media and the writer and activist who created The Love Life of an Asian Guy. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We have Gisela Plazas, CEO and Senior Account Executive of Presidio Insurance. Welcome, welcome. And then we have Alan Cordoba-Diaz, New York-based actor and writer. So welcome. We also have Matthew Cuban, poet, teacher, creator, performance and writing coach here in the Los Angeles area. Welcome.
Hey, everybody.
Okay, so you all have been asked here for a very, interesting question because at face value it might be easy to answer, but for some people it might be confusing. Like, what is a person of color? So I would just like everyone to kind of give their own take on what this question answer would be. Um, Anyone want to take a stab at it first?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it.
All right.
So I guess, person of color, there's, at least in my mind, two sort of definitions, either the super simplified or the more specified. In general, it's sort of all non-white people, but more specifically, I'd say it's non-white people who understand that their past, their present, and their future have all been distorted by a common enemy in white supremacy.
Okay. Anyone else want to give their take?
Yeah, I'll go. Hi, everybody.
Go ahead.
So what is a person of color? Just to add to that, it's definitely someone who has to be aware. It's more than just being non-white. It has to be, at least in my opinion, an opting in of, identifying with some of the barriers and things that, people of color or non-white people deal with as a direct result of white supremacy. So for me, it's not enough to just say, oh, I'm non-white, therefore I automatically am a person of color. It's a participation, it's an alliance, and it's a movement together to discuss something and create safe spaces for people to identify with trying to discuss things such as white supremacy.
Okay. Giselle, it sounded like you were.
Yeah, I tend to, when I think of color, I think culture. I don't necessarily narrow down to what a person looks like because I know a lot of people who identify as a person of color, even though on the outside they may not look it, and I might be an example of that. I identify as, very much as a Latino woman, very brown in my culture, in my foods, in my music, in my family values. So for me, I think culture plays very much into what is a person of color, maybe as much as what you look like on the outside.
I think it's a tricky question. In some ways, I think sometimes the term "person of color," people of color, it kind of gets co-opted and used in kind of ugly ways. I'm trying to figure out, is it okay to say bad words? I won't say them. I don't have to.
This is a safe space, so I don't want to
Shitty
censor anyone.
ways. They do it in shitty ways. And I think like it's there's a very big distinction between like a person of color and a passing person of color, right? Someone who is you have very passing skin, right? Like there's diaspora of Cuban people who are white Cubans, and in this country identify as people of color, but don't have to deal with some of the prejudice that come with being a person with color, right? With melanin in their skin, right? And I think about that because I think sometimes there is a large community of people who will say, oh, well, I'm a person of color, I'm dealing with the same things. And it's like, nah, there are literal shades of difference that are happening, whether you're a person of color with dark complexion or not, right? And I think that's a big thing. And there's a huge movement that's like, don't call me a person of color, I'm black, or don't call me a person of color, I'm this. And I think that has a place somewhere in it too, but I think it gets tricky, you know? For me, like when you identify as a person of color, I think that for me, the image has to be like, like how much are you dealing with colorism, with people looking at you like, and there is a very real conversation that needs to be had of like, you are very passing and how much privilege is given even in that, right? So I don't know what kind of can I just opened up, but that's kind of where I am with it loosely off the head.
This question is a little bit of an inside joke for us. Because one of our mutual friends literally asked it on a post, and we're like, isn't it kind of clear? Like, don't you know what a person of color is? So, and they're clearly a person of color, or they may identify as otherwise. But Alan, go ahead. Sorry.
I have to say, I kind of lean to, I don't want to copy anybody's answers, but I kind of lean toward Gisela's answer, which is basically, it kind of goes with culture, not necessarily just the person's skin, because that's the way I look at it. It's more so in the culture, because nowadays, person of color, they could look white, so to speak, and actually still be a person of color, based off of their culture, their father could be black, their mother could be white, and then they could end up looking like they're white, but in reality, they would be considered a person of color. And then it could even go further back. You could even look at their grandparents. They might even have that culture in them. So I kind of veer more toward that aspect of the culture wise for a person of color. At least that's how I feel. So
my personal outlook on it is kind of a two-pronged approach. So ethnically, and I want to find ways, maybe you guys can help me, of centering people of color in the definition instead of using like non-white or non-European, which is going to be kind of difficult because it's literally necessary to show what we're trying. It's exclusive, particularly, but like how do we center ourselves while defining it? And then, as Naeema mentioned, the opt-in to the community, it's very much so part of like pairing with ethnicity. That community aspect of it is required. So you can't be in community with me unless you are for me, for us all together. And that's just my bottom line when I think of what a person of color is. I kind of want to see if anyone wants to help out with that definition that's kind of centering ourselves, or your take on it. Any responses to that idea? Naeema?
Yeah, I actually have an example, and Sammy, I don't know if you and I've ever mentioned this to you, but I was talking to someone who is from China, and she mentioned that like this is when I started thinking about like the notion of opting in, because she's from China, I don't think she saw herself as a person of color. And she said that she didn't even understand the term until a white person actually told her she was. So she was practicing whatever art form she was practicing, and they were like, yes, we need more voices of color. And she was the only like non-white person in the group, and they assigned that for her without her having any context to what that meant. And so we talked about it, you know, when she said she first got here, she was like, she was very confused. So I asked her like, well, do you consider yourself a person of color? Because I most certainly did not consider you or assumed you were, because I don't know how you put that into context with, you know, being an international person, like non-American person, what that means. And so she said it's taking her a while to understand that term. And even then, the term again is like very complicated, right? So, but I appreciated the fact that she thought about it. And she said at this point, she does consider herself a person of color. And that's when I was like, oh, so you chose to like, you know, kind of opt in, or whatever experiences you saw that aligned with a lot of other experiences. But I feel like it's a very American centered thing. And I find it kind of weird when particularly white people decide who the person of color is, because I don't know, I distrust if they're trying to like fill some sort of quota, just like my experiences in the work that I'm in, or if they're like trying to be politically correct, but like not understand that that term is nuanced. And so I just feel like when you're talking about centering, it really has to be a self-identified thing, and we really can't expect other people to identify that for us. Like I have to openly say I'm a person of color. I identify as a Black person, you know, it's a little complicated with my identity, as I've mentioned to you before, but you know, I call myself a person of color while also claiming Black. And I think that people who are opting in as people of color can still say they're a person of color and I'm, you know, Latino, or I'm Asian, or I'm this, and that's like your identity. And I feel weird arguing with people, like telling them that they're not or they are. So I have to like let them tell me so that they can identify to me how they identify. And that's a way of centering themselves, I guess, in the conversation.
Follow-up question: is that why you use phrasing like Black woman of color? Is that to kind of share both in the same?
I don't say Black person of color. I say Black woman and a person of color. So it's really just because of my own identity in general, because I don't, you know, as a Black person, I still identify with some multicultural, what they call multicultural aspects of, you know, the culture, the ethnicity, but I recognize that I go through life and certain experiences as a Black woman. So I identify as a Black woman, but I also identify as a person of color because that's me opting into an alliance and of different experiences that people are having. And also certain experiences that I'm not having as a Black woman that other people are having. So it really depends on like the context, and I switch back and forth really depending on who I'm talking to. Like for applications, for grants, things like that, I'm like, I'm a Black person. But then I also will say like, you know, and talking about the ethics of making a documentary, I'll be like, people of color need to tell their own stories, whoever that is, you know.
Has anyone struggled with kind of opting into this new terminology of a community or considering themselves a person of color? I definitely see within my own community, there's a little bit of pushback with kind of using the term person of color if you mean Black. Just had a conversation about it recently. It kind of gets lost in there. I kind of want to talk about some issues that are kind of unique to one culture or ethnicity that fits under the umbrella. Maybe if someone could speak to their own background, kind of differentiating, like, do you have issues using person of color when you really should have used maybe Latinx or specific things, or Asian?
Well, I think one of the tricky things in general about the label of person of color is that you can look at it so many different ways. people can identify you as whether or not you fit into that group. You can self-identify or you can choose not to. And then there's also looking at person of color as sort of how you envision the future of our communities to look like. I guess the way that I sort of look at it, person of color is sort of this, like Naeema said, it's this category that you opt in because it's sort of a recognition that there is the opposite of person of color, which is white, which was for the longest time considered normal, and anyone of color was sort of the aberration of white. And so I think for me, identifying with person of color is about seeing the unity within these fragmented communities who have been disadvantaged by white supremacy. So I know that everybody has a very custom tailored vision of what POC means. And it's this fluid label that sometimes people grow out of, or sometimes people feel that they need to enhance by saying, okay, well, maybe we need to change POC to by POC. And so there are all these different evolutions. And I think it really is just a testament to the fact that there are a lot of people of color who are still trying to find that community. And I think maybe POC is just the first iteration of what we envision to be more unification among these different marginalized communities.
I guess we should probably spend some time on that BIPOC. That popped up recently for me. I had never heard of that term or acronym. So does anyone suddenly I want to say within the last month is when I was exposed to it. So I believe it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Does anyone know of why it kind of came to be?
Sammy, I've never heard of it, so maybe I'm showing my age. I have no idea.
Literally within the last.
I've never heard of it.
Month. Okay.
I guess my, at least hearing it, I know that a lot of people just feel like, like you can have a Trump voter who's the most self-hating person, who's like, there's like this rise in, Asian Americans who are voting for Trump, and they're like, oh, well, I'm a POC, so, can't you acknowledge me? I'm like, hold on a second, like, we're getting a little bit loose with this definition over here. But I think the sort of advent of BIPOC is, at least from what I've seen, a lot of Black and Indigenous communities feeling like, hey, a lot of these people are adopting this terminology, but they're making it seem as if we're all in the same spectrum, that Asian people, oh, well, you're a person of color, you're Asians, and so then that means that your pain is the same as someone who's Black or someone who's Indigenous. And I think that was just that separation to really just say, hey, maybe we need to have a little bit more nuance in these other two communities that are sort of being talked over. So at least that's just how I observed how it played out.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I never heard the term either. And just thinking about what you just said, I understand that like there's a nuance to like everyone experiencing different things. Like I said, like as a Black person, there are things that I've also never experienced. And I'm like, I always believe someone when they tell me, because I'm like, wow, because I don't know what your experience is. And in the same way that I expect someone to also believe me when I say like these experiences, this is something I've gone through. But I wonder, like, is that a way of kind of, and I hate this term, but I don't know another one, like oppression Olympics, where people are like, I have it worse, so I should be this. And it's like, it's very different. I don't like to, this sounds very simplistic, and I don't know how to like say this where I'm like, oh, yours wasn't so bad, so like, you should center this issue, when it's not black and white to me like that. It's just like, this is something that has happened to these people or this group of people or this type of person, and it needs to be acknowledged and addressed. So I wonder, with the way that you explained how that term is defined, if that's like maybe playing into any of that. Because again, I never heard of it until maybe a month ago, and I'm in these circles talking like exclusively with women of color. Like that's the type of activism I do in the arts here in the Chicago area. So I'm just like, I'm curious to like what everyone thinks about that.
I know that term just that term just snuck up out of nowhere. I think I heard it like the other day, and no one's been able to define it for me. So I'm actually intrigued if someone else can do it, because I have no idea what that term is. So
I think it's an appeal to making sure that we're highlighting all the voices that are within the umbrella, like highlighting what kind of needs some more priority, without just saying just POC, because it really just gets lost if you just say POC, because that could be anyone under the umbrella of a non-white person. And there are so many nuances to those identities, so many struggles that are nuanced within certain communities as well. I mean, colorism is a great example of it's global. I don't know if we want to go into that, but that is very much so something that I would say kind of causes some issues within our own communities before we even get to the we're all in this together situation. Speaking to that, how do we kind of create these safe spaces so that we can, discuss issues like we are now and working together?
Sandy, so it's kind of an interesting thing for me. I've already talked about the cultural and ethnic piece, but this is also a very American thing. Growing up in Chicago, actually, it was very clear that there was the us group of non-Americans and the Americans, and we identified the Americans as white. And you and I have spoken, and you'll often hear me say, well, yeah, it's they're just acting like that because they're white. Even though I look very white, it's an ethnic thing. And it's a very American thing to identify as, person of color. In most other parts of the world, at least in the parts that I've frequented and where all my friends are from, we kind of look at it as American versus non-American. It just so happens we all identify real American, which is not true, as white. So it's kind of an interesting, but I am curious what everybody's thoughts are on why to identify or not identify as a person of color. As you know, I do identify as a person of color, but it's because I was raised in that. I was raised to be a woman of color because it's just what I grew up in. And growing up in Chicago, it's very common for all of us to identify ethnically. And there were the white neighborhoods, and then there was the Latin neighborhoods, and eventually ended up being Puerto Rican. Even it wasn't even just Latin, and then it was the Polish neighborhoods. And so it was more ethnicity is how I've always envisioned it. I think it's more recent that it's become this skin color thing, at least for me. But that's my thought on it.
I want to echo what you were just saying, because I think it is an American issue. I didn't cut anybody off, did I?
No.
I'm getting like a slight delay on some of these. But yeah, I think it's a super American issue. Like I remembered, everybody was like, "Oh, when you go to France, when you go to Paris, man, they're gonna be so mean to you because you're American." And I was like, "These fools don't know I'm American." They showed me mad love. They're just like coming up and talking to me, just like everybody's mad polite. Like, so I think it's a very much, an American thing. And I think it's interesting that we put these things, like I think like in my life, like I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. Like I have been I've been given the title like mad races, like mad different races that they've called me. Like when I was in second grade, I was like Filipino for like 4 months. Like it was like my teacher was like, "Oh yeah, you're Filipino. You give me all these Filipino facts."
That's a long
and like
time.
I'd come home and then like finally I came home.
Months.
Yeah, it was great. I had so much culture I was learning. It was dope. Like I came home and I'm telling my mom like, yeah, because we're Filipino. She's like, no, there's not. Like what? Like but like my mother's a black woman. Her father was black, but he grew up in Cuba, and she grew up in Honduras. So when they came to this country, they're like, what? Like we're not black, like we're Cuban, we're Jamaican, we're these things, and it took so much understanding, like in our culture and the way we grew up. Like I didn't know I'm like 7 different things. So I had to fully understand that even the people who were quote unquote a majority of my culture, they didn't like me because they thought I was just American. They were like, you don't even speak, you speak with a thick American accent, you're not one of us. So this idea of like being a person of color almost became like, it was like an amalgamation of all these things. I'm like, I'm a bunch of shit. Like, I'm like 7 different things. So yeah, I'm just a person of color. Like, you know, you spill a bunch of paint on the ground, you get your boy, you know? And so, that was kind of like where came this culture for me, but it's definitely an American thing for sure. Because I think when you go outside this country, you get these different cultures, you know, like the Irish and Celtic culture are dope as hell, but like white people don't want to be like, they don't want to say they're these things. It's like, you have warriors that you could be claiming, that's your ancestors, but that, again, there's this cutoff that comes when entering this country, that assimilation is all encompassing, even for whites, you know?
Yeah, sorry, sort of piggybacking off of what you were saying about, you know, a lot of times I'm sort of flabbergasted that more white people don't, you know, really lean into the actual European parts of their culture, and so many of them almost sacrifice that and openly say that, well, I'm an American and I'm white and that's what I am and that's my culture. And I think for a lot of people of color who are hesitant about that label, I think there's also that fear of, you know, what do we give up by joining this group? You know, is there something that we also lose? Is there also a part of our identity that gets lost by taking on this this label? And I think that's why you have labels like BIPOC coming up, because you have people who feel like, you know, maybe the inclusion that I got was at the expense of some of my erasure. And so now we have to go ahead and update that quote. And so I think it's really interesting just seeing how different people of color interact with the term POC and how different people try to construct communities out of this. Because I see it all the time. Like I a lot of the content that I write is very pro POC, you know, very like, I see it as, you know, a deep appreciation for our community's flaws and advantages, and not looking at that as an opportunity to say, oh, well, your community does this, so you can't say anything about us. It's more like, okay, you guys are going through that, cool, let's go ahead and uplift your issues. And I think for a lot of people, they feel like in that sort of rift to find to sort of have a space on this platform, I think a lot of people feel like they're sort of slowly being pushed out. And so I think that's why there's that expansion of this term.
Yeah, both of what you guys, all 3 of you said, just made me think about, like, I don't remember actually, I don't think I was raised as a person of color. So, and it's a weird thing to say. And I don't think I was like, my family wasn't like super race conscious, at least not as a child to me. I think I have a child, I have a 4-year-old, and I'm trying to kind of let him know certain things just because I was shocked when I got older by like everything, like it was a culture shock. And this is someone who, I was born and raised in New York City, proud New Yorker, but like I grew up in, you know, immigrant communities, and that's where I felt like I fit in the most. I myself, you know, I'm an American. My family has been here for a very long time. That's not something to celebrate or anything. It's just a fact that my family has been here for a very long time. But just the interesting thing to me is that I remember hearing the term person of color when I was a teenager, and I felt like that fit for me because I did not identify with being called African American, because that particular thing did not make sense to me, just because I am American and I did not have a connection to Africa. And that does not mean I did not know I was of African descent. It just means I was like, okay, Kwanzaa, like I don't, you know, as a child, that was not really put into context for me from my mother's family. And then my dad just being like, you know, casually, but like not really talking about it, like, oh yeah, I'm Native American, and then like moving on, and I'm like, what does that mean? You know, I don't know what any of these things mean. And so I remember saying to my grandmother, like, you know, my mother's mother, who identifies as Black, or at the time identified as African American, like, actually, I think I'm a person of color. And she was like, what is that? You know, like, where is that phrase coming from? And I explained it to her, like, this is not a rejection of like, you know, any African roots or where I came from, like, however long ago. This is just, this feels like an identity I can take on as an American from New York City, growing up around everybody, right? And still experiencing prejudice. Most of my prejudice experiences came from people of color, but there's a lot to unpack at a different time for that. But, you know, I explained her the phrase, and now my grandmother also calls herself a person of color. I don't know how I was a teenager so long ago that I don't remember since then her saying, I'm an African American or African Americans, that she's like, people of color need to do this, people of color need to do that. And when she needs to be very specific, she'll say Black person. But like, other than that, she just views it again with that, like, you know, I guess in the lens of like white supremacy. Like, our experiences with white supremacy are very specific to this experience. And, you know, my family runs the gamut politically. I have Trump supporters in my family who are darker than me, and I'm interested in that, I'll say that. But, you know, we're not a monolith, none of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's why, again, when I think of person of color, it's like this activation that happens, especially because you're in a America, which is complicated, right? Very, very complicated, very strange, very violent toward different types of people. There has to be, for me, there's some connection, and I'm like, oh, I align with people who think like this. And that's where, to me, I realized I was a person of color, and how I'm trying to raise my son to be a person of color, if that makes sense. Like, I'm not, my son is half Puerto Rican, and I'm not thinking of him like, you know, if he identifies more with being Puerto Rican, that doesn't mean anything to me in terms of like, oh, now he's not Black or whatever. Like, it doesn't mean anything, because I'm thinking person of color, you're in America, this is how you can relate to people in certain experiences you're gonna have that other people just won't have to have by default, you know, for whatever reason. So that was very long-winded, but I'm trying to like, you know, say I basically like agree with you guys in terms of like thinking about person of color and like how the term comes about. And I'm interested in this by POC, or is it, I've never heard it said out loud. By POC or
I've heard
BIPOC?
BIPOC, and Ranier vocalizes as by POC, so we're gonna accept all
Okay.
Don't blame me if I
BIPOC.
mess it up.
BIPOC works with me. It's what I always assumed of him anyways.
Okay, I kind of like BIPOC, but I don't want to say it out loud when someone's like, what? So, but I'm going to stand firm in this position of being like, no, BIPOC, by POC, BI. Okay, got it. So yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
I feel as though I've been thinking that POC has been a more recent term, but I recently saw a show, I want to say The Golden Girls, which is hilarious that this is my reference, but it was actually used back then. So this is, I want to say back in the 80s would be when that episode did air. So it's kind of interesting how we think
all
of
the way back then, huh, Sammy?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I'm 32, so it was that's 30 years of thinking something like, okay, it was like a 5-year-old term. No, it's been used frequently and throughout the years, because there have been many different terms used for us as a collective community as well. So it's kind of interesting over the years. Does anyone want to tell any stories of when they kind of came to their I guess activation of identifying as a person of color? Because mine is very recent, kind of opting into this community, like vocalizing it. I've always been, you know, down, but it's different. It's different if you vocalize it as opposed to, okay, this is my community. I want to do the work for everyone who considers themselves a person of color. Because a little background, the Ashe Academy is empowering students of color who are going into the fields of the arts and STEM fields. So we have to define what a student of color is, a person of color. Like, what does that mean? Who can apply for all of the things that we're doing? Who is our target? Any stories about their own identity of reaching that point of, okay, like, yeah, I opt in.
I can tell a brief
Sure.
telling of how I kind of came to this. You know, Jacksonville, Florida. It's the most progressive place. If you've been there, it's pretty dope. We're so progressive. We're inviting all the Republicans in. But that's where I grew up. And when I grew up, I remember like in first grade, like everybody would be like, "You're white," and I'd be like, "I'm not white. I'm Hispanic." They'd be like, "That's not even real." I'd be like, "Oh damn! Like I thought I existed. Like I was so sure." And I kept, you know, I even in like middle school, I got the nickname Cuban, because like all these kids would come to me, like, "Oh, dude, what are you, Mexican?" I'm like, "No, I'm not Mexican. I'm Cuban as far as I know." Like, "All right, Cuban," and it stuck. And I was like, "All right." And so I carried this thing growing up that I'm like, I guess I'm Cuban, right? But I'm like a lot more than that, right? There's like a lot more in me than Cuban, right? In fact, I'm not even super fluent in Spanish. In fact, I'm like super gringo, you know what I mean? In Spanish, like as far as my language, as far as speaking and understanding it. And I felt so distant from that, like pretty much my whole life, that I was like, I guess I'm Cuban. Like it's my nickname, it's this moniker, it's my stage or whatever that I've built over this years. And when the term person of color kind of rolled around me, I was like, that feels a lot more accurate to what I am, because I don't really know nothing about this place, right? I grew up in this culture. I grew up in Latinx culture, which that's a funny conversation with my father. He's like, Latinx, like, what does that mean? Like the next generation of Latin? Like, is that us? Is that what this is? I'm like, no, I don't think that's what it is, man. You know, and even the term Latinx and how that is and like I've heard a lot that's like an English solution to a Spanish problem, and it should actually be Latinidad. And there's so much more conversations that are having it in there. But I remember like when I came up to the point, I was like, person of color, that feels a lot more like me, and I don't have to list off 7 different generations of ethnicity in my family to be like, well, actually, I'm a little Jamaican, a little this, I'm a little Palestinian, and this. Like, I can just be like, I'm a person of color. I got a gang of shit in me, all right? If you want to know, like, you know what I mean? So that was kind of my story of understanding that.
Awesome. There's been a lot of people assigning things to you. How does that feel?
Confusing. So confusing. I mean, and then to be in a place like Florida where, again, I think somebody spoke about the violence of how this country can be sometimes, where it's like there's so much safety in the assimilation of it, you know, and growing up, you know, there was this such fear and trauma that my family came with, that my father was very skeptical in teaching his kids Spanish. Like he would not teach us the language. And he's fluent in both. Like he doesn't have an accent. But he was like, I don't want y'all to have an accent. I'm like, you don't have a fucking accent, bro. Like, what's going on here? But like to literally be of an act of choice to cut off your culture, like that blows my mind now as an adult. And yeah, it's kind of horrible. It kind of sucks a lot in a lot of ways. And yeah, therapy.
Did you say therapy?
I did say therapy.
Yes,
Yeah, I did.
yes,
Yeah.
we're advocates
Shouts
for
out.
that.
Shouts out.
Yes,
Shouts out.
yes, definitely. Self-care, mental health.
Mad important.
Exactly. Ranier, did you?
Yeah. So I think my adoption of the term came when I was writing and I talk about my experiences as a Filipino American, and I say, oh, you know, as a Filipino American, I experience X, Y, Z, and then at first I'd get these comments from people and say, hey, you know, well, I'm Mexican and I experience that too, or I'm Black and I experience that too, and I'd go, okay, cool. So then my next post I'd say, Asians and Black people and Mexicans experience, and then like over time I would just get, I'm from Spain, I'm from Persia, and it's like I couldn't, I like my post was at a certain point I was just like listing off all these different cultures. Like from a writing perspective, I was like, oh my god, like this is kind of frustrating. And then I learned that person of color is this term, and I was like, okay. And then at that same time, I was sort of reconciling with the fact that, you know, as a Filipino, as a Filipino American, I don't connect with Filipinos in the Philippines, and even among Filipinos, you know, a lot of Filipinos don't feel like I belong with them because I don't have the same interests, or I don't look like a lot of other Filipinos. A lot of Filipinos think that I look more Chinese, but even among East Asians, they don't claim me either. So I've always felt like I was just in this limbo of like, I'm just a brown blob. And I think like POC just became this great way of saying, oh, okay, well, like I don't fully fit in with any of these things, but I do know that there are certain characteristics that I have in common with a lot of other people. And I think this label sort of succinctly describes that identity.
Awesome. Alan, did you want to jump in?
Because I had a couple things, and I kept hearing everybody else's. But the funny thing for me is, it's similar to Matthew's story about not being able to fit in or being told you don't fit in because of the way I speak. Where I grew up on the Upper West Side. So whenever everybody hears that, and they're just like, "Oh, that's the rich area, so of course you don't, that's the white area." And I was like, it wasn't that way when I grew up. It was pretty bad. But either way, I think around high school, I want to say, because everybody kept saying I'm Dominican and Colombian, and people would be like, "Oh, you're not really Dominican." Mind you, I was one of the only people in my school who actually had been to Dominican Republic, but because they felt I didn't belong, so eventually I was just like, well, you can't take away people of color because I do have some color to myself. At that time, that's what I connected it to. Obviously, as I've grown up, I've matured, I look at it in a different way. But I kind of came to that conclusion because almost as a defense mechanism to combat everybody else telling me I didn't belong because of the way I spoke and what was it, where I was raised and all that stuff. But like now, I still call myself a person of color, but I still say I am Latino, I'm Dominican, I'm Colombian. I basically say everything because I'm just unifying them all. That's what I am. So it started in high school as a defense mechanism in a way, but it just grew to that's who I am now, and that's really, there's no way of taking that away from me. They could try if they want to, but it's who I am. So high school, more or less defense mechanism, grown up to be me. There you go.
Awesome. I think we need to do a lot more self-identifying and vocalizing it just so we can get it out there and let people know, like, this is what I identify as, that you cannot just assign things to me. And kind of circling back to the African American reference Naeema made, I feel like that is Pandora's box because there are a lot of people who use it to other, and I'm trying to be careful with my words. The intention behind taking this time to kind of vocalize it correctly is that you do not want to refute any ties to Africanism, because of course I'm of African descent. That's black, but nothing to refute that. But I don't like when it's used as a PC term. When it's really, you want to say black, say black. But if you're talking about black issues, say black issues. And it's also not accurate for everyone to use African American. If you have another country of origin, African American will not apply to you if you are of Jamaican descent. It might just be Jamaican American. Like, don't just apply everything to everyone. And there's people who are coming from specific countries like Nigeria, so they need to be Nigerian American. They don't just need to be African American. So there's just a lot there, and I feel like there's a lot of issues that we carry into the community from our own, if we're going to call POC and a community itself. So what would you say things that you kind of set as a boundary for your community to discuss amongst themselves? And I'll start out with that does not come into the umbrella at large. For example, a language, in terms of African American vernacular English, I would certainly say would be like a boundary that's not for everyone to use, kind of bleeding into the N-word. Not everyone in the POC at large needs to be using that word. And that's for ourselves to kind of discuss whether or not we want to be using it or if we want to even have that discussion amongst the Black community. So that's kind of like the boundaries that I'm looking for from you guys. Like what boundaries do you guys carry into, hey, we don't go there, we are a collective, but leave that alone.
Yeah, I guess.
You go. You go.
Okay.
Go for it.
I was thinking
There's a
about
lot
that.
to unpack, Naeema. That's why.
Because I'm thinking about conversations you and I have had over what 15 years that we've known each
Yeah,
other, 10 years,
we
whatever.
don't need to tell our age like that.
I don't think it matters at this point. But you know, being from New York, with the N word in particular, I know you and I have had many conversations about this because in New York, like I felt like I grew up in people of color communities. I did not grow up like around white people exclusively, or even like white people in my world where I went to the store and they like assumed I was stealing a lemon when I was just like picking a lemon to like put in a bag and outside like the fruit stands, because I too grew up on the Upper West Side, Alan. So I grew up on I grew up in the projects actually, Frederick Douglass on 102nd and Columbus in Amsterdam. So over there, part of my childhood. So, but like the schools I went to, they were mostly PoC, and that is some sort of Black and Latinx, mixture. And people said the N-word, and I just assumed, I guess not assumed it was okay. I just never felt a way about it. I don't like the word in general because I was always taught not to say it, but like it being said in school around like my peers, as long as they were brown, it didn't really register as something not to say. It was only until like I was a teenager, and funny enough, I went to a high school in Lower Manhattan that for some reason was like 80% of Asian descent, and specifically Chinese. They were mostly Chinese descent. And there was like a little pocket of us like Black and Hispanic. And this is when I started thinking about being POC, because I could align myself with this little pocket of people. Because at the time when I first got to high school, we were all very like separated. And then, at the end, it was a happy ending. We're all friends. But at the time we were not. And so I heard a person whose family is from China use the word. And I was like, what is that? And so confused. And I was trying to, well, are you from Harlem? Like, are you from Brooklyn? Like, I don't understand why you're using this word. And it became a thing where, problematic thinking, of course, but the whole situation was problematic. I'm like, you're from Chinatown. You can't use that word, and that's where I was drawing the boundaries of like experiences people are having. That goes off the point of AV, or African American Vernacular English. There's also like some people in the Black community who use it that I often would be questioning, are you from these areas where you grew up speaking like this? Because I was always taught to speak properly and don't like use slang. Like my grandmother had a huge thing, you cannot use slang to me. You can curse, but you can't use slang. I don't know why, but that was her thing. And so to see, certain Black people, for instance, who were like from the suburbs, AKA you, Sammy, just to call you out, who would start speaking like this, I'd be like, well, where are you learning this from? Is your family speaking like this? Like, why are you like, it felt very like specific and not for everyone there either. And I'm still like, I don't pay attention to it much anymore, but I do pay attention to how I speak because, even being, since moving to the Chicago area, New York's, we know New York slang. No one understands that here, so I'll say certain words, and they're like, what are you talking about? And then I have to remember like, oh, there's like a different language here. But I also like, don't feel comfortable using like Southside Black Chicago slang either, unless I'm like given permission, I guess, because even though, we're all from the same communities, it's very specified and very specific, and I feel like there's like a weird boundary I'm still trying to figure out.
There's dialects within the vernacular.
Right, and so like saying the N-word, using certain terms, it's just like, what is your experience to like allow you to say that? It sounds very gatekeeping, but that's just where my mind goes. Like, I'm like, whoa, like, where'd you pick up that word? Where are you from? Like, what's going on there? I'm just so curious as to how you can use language. And I feel like it's because language is used against us so much, like having to speak proper English, no accent, and why, my husband can't speak Spanish because his parents wouldn't speak Spanish to him for the exact same reason Yeah, there's just like a lot there in terms of like language and boundaries. Like that's where it goes for me, like boundaries on language. And it's something I'm still kind of unpacking and trying to figure out like what is the correct way to be, because I still don't know. I just know that I react to like people speaking a certain way, if that made any sense to anybody, because that was very long-winded. So
Anyone else? Language, Alan?
For me?
Oh wait, Matt.
Yeah,
Matthew,
I'll say a little something on it. Yeah, Naeema, that was perfectly put too. I think so.
He's snapping off camera.
I was going. I'm telling you, dog. I'm over here snapping up like it's a poetry slam in this mug. I number one, I feel like I'm talking a lot, so I'm gonna sit back and do some listening for the rest of this.
But
But
no, you guys are talking perfectly.
I think language and use of language is it should and should be exclusive, right? I think I think like the N word specifically is an oppressive word, same as like the B word when speaking about women, same as the F word, speaking about people who are dealing with sexuality, right? Like if I've never been oppressed by this word, I don't get to use it, right? Like I think like that's a pretty good rule right there. Like if I've never been like I don't use the B word as a man because I've never been oppressed by this word, right? My life has never been threatened with that. And I think as men, like, we just shouldn't be using that kind of language, right? It's a very violent and oppressive word. So I don't like use it, right? And so I think that across the line of everything. Now, growing up in a certain culture, if you're around it and you're like, oh, my friends use it, so it's cool. I don't know. That always felt tricky for me. Like I teach in an environment where I'm teaching juvenile detention facilities in Los Angeles, which is primarily Black and brown kids. But every now and then, there's like one white kid who seemingly doesn't know he's white and is just like dropping everything he can, and nobody there cares. And I'm looking at the kids like, I feel like y'all should care a little bit, and they just don't. And then on the other end, we'll get like a person of Mexican descent who is like blonde hair, blue eyes, but like is straight as Mexican as it comes, right? And there's very white passing who will use that word very, cavalier because everybody in their culture around them uses it like it's nothing, right? But then we'll hate Black people, which is wild, right? There's very like hard racism within like the gang and prison communities, especially in Los Angeles, hard racism, right? And so it blows my mind, and it's like you'll be rapping, you'll be using the vernacular, but you hate Black people. Like, where is this? What is happening here? So it does get very troublesome very quickly if you just give passes to people to just freely. But I think at the end of the day, if it's something that you've been actively oppressed by, if it's something that you've dealt with trauma by, but somebody's called you that directly, if you decide that it's something that you want to reclaim for yourself as something empowerment, do you feel me? I just don't think like if you have a certain level of shade to your skin, you're probably not going to be oppressed by this, right? So you probably shouldn't use it, and you're probably doing more harm than good by using it, right? You're not reclaiming it for something at that point. You're just giving somebody else who might look like you a pass to do this problematic shit. So, I kind of be like, if you ain't been oppressed by it, don't use it across the board about any language,
Exactly.
So, Sammy, it's kind of interesting from the Latina standpoint, and you'll notice I don't use Latinx. I am a Latina, and it's a respect to my language that I was raised with, right? But for us, the N word for Latinas and Latinos was spake or wetback, and we used to go like, I'm not even Mexican. How can I be? I can't swim from Colombia here. Like, it's just not physically possible. But so different, obviously it was a different vernacular. And because growing up in Chicago, I was identified in the Latinos and the Blacks, we identified together against the white Americans. And that was just, and it sounds weird now, but back then in the 80s, that is what we did. It was very normal for us amongst each other to use the N word, though clearly I'm not Black, because many of my best friends were Black and they used it. I sort of adopted it. And then now looking back, like, God, that's awful that I did. But at the time we were very unified in that. But none of my Black friends would ever use the word spick with me because it was understood we didn't use it amongst ourselves, and only white Americans used it against me when they were being, because I would speak Spanish. It was my primary language when I was a child, and what we spoke at home, and that was my first language. And so when I used it out on the streets, it was hard because I was called a spick and this and that, because I was using the language, and I didn't, you could see I looked pretty white. But I identified very brown, and I spoke and ate, and everything was very brown about the way I was raised. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting how language does become something that we all use in terms of identity. Like, it was a really bad thing, the spick thing. So my Black friends would never call me a spick. I mean, you would never do that because they understood it was a hurtful term. But I could use the N-word when I was a kid with my Black friends. I wouldn't now, but at the time, nobody thought anything of it. You know, it was very normal for us. And we were all kids of color compared to the, you know, white kids at our school, because we were in a private school where there was very few of us, and it was mainly white American kids. I keep saying white, and I have to stop using that term, but anyway. And by the way, I have to say to the other participant here, Viva Colombia.
Alan.
Appreciate that.
Oh yeah, you were gonna.
No,
say
I was gonna say, well, because I had a lot of friends who used it, and then I was like, I'm not gonna touch on that. You know, I had a lot of Black friends who said it often, and then I'd have Hispanic friends say it, and sometimes they would actually tell me, you know, if you want, you could say it, and I was like, I'm not gonna fall for that, so I'm just gonna stay. I'm gonna keep it cool. You guys can say whatever you want. Now, I remember this one incident though. I was doing a show. It was a play, and it was me. There was one other guy who was Hispanic, and then everybody else was white. And I remember he was sitting outside the dressing room, and I was there late, and when I got there, I walk into the dressing room, and it was basically all the white actors talking about who can use the N-word and then who can't. And I was like, I don't want to. I walked out, and after, he just looked at me, and he was just like, yeah, I didn't want to say anything, but that's their problem, and I don't think that's a conversation that they should be having. And I was like, listen, I just want to act. That's it, man. But it was weird because I was thinking about that, and I'm like, I mean, their conversation wasn't offensive. It was basically, I don't know what started it. That's the thing. But a lot of them was basically throwing it out there like, it's an offensive term. It's horrible. No one should, like, you shouldn't be able to say it. It's just really oppressive. And it was kind of enlightening in a way, because I was like, that's good that they understand the horrific nature of, you know, behind the word, the N-word. But it was just weird because I felt kind of bad, because I was like, I don't think they should be talking about who could say it and who they can't, because, you know, they don't know the difference. You know, they don't really know the severity of it. But they were educating themselves, so it was nice to hear that. But I know for me personally, I'm not 100% comfortable using it. I have used it before when, you know, when I felt was certain situations where I was like really cool, but that's what I thought. But I know right now I'm like, that's just an off limits word for me, because there's a lot of pain that's attached to it. And I know within a certain group of people that it's about taking the word back, but that is, like, you know, I do appreciate that that's the goal that they want. It's just, it's such a slippery slope with that, you know, it's such a slippery slope. But I just know for me, stay away from that word and just let, you know, people want to use it, they want to use it, you know, to take it back, power to them. So.
Now, not vernacularly, but any other, I hate to say foreign languages just because it's a very Western thought to say that is foreign. But does anyone take offense when non-Spanish speakers, someone speaking that way to you? Just assuming you speak a certain language? I'm kind of curious to see if anyone has, you know, oh, you look Latinx or Latin, so you must speak Spanish or Portuguese, and I'm going to speak it to you.
Is this question directly towards me?
I'm not directing it.
I
You don't know
like
my background.
I feel called out here. Yeah, it's everyone. Everyone comes up to me and just starts talking I was in Dubai, and they were just like, I was like, I'm used to see. You know, it happens. It happens frequently. I'm an honorary Samoan. I just can't tell them I'm not. They're very, you know, they're super excited to see me all the time. Like, Uso, I'm like, yeah, okay, you know. So I'm honorary Samoan. But no, yeah, it happens a lot. I'm never offended. I usually just like have like a small internal cry, and question my whole life, and just like, you know, pretty much have to convince myself I'm not a phony. But you know, yeah, I'm never offended. I'm usually like, hell yeah, still got it, still there, still look like this.
Oh man, Rainier, any
I mean,
thoughts?
in terms of like, you know, people coming up to me and assuming that I speak a certain way, I've gotten it so many times from different Asian people who come up to me. Like, I think one of the funniest times was like this older Chinese lady came up to me. She was speaking in Mandarin, and I had just taken a Mandarin class, so I knew just enough to respond to her. But I was like, wait, hold on a second. I need to not do that because I don't want to get into this conversation and be like, oh, sorry, I can only say hello. But I mean, yeah, I've had it with like all different types of Asian people, and it's cool because, you know, it's I like that in some ways that people feel that, you know, I'm someone that they can talk to, especially with Asian people, especially with Filipinos. It's always cool to, you know, spot a Filipino and you can hear like the inflection of the accent, and I'm like, and they pick it up, and usually the calling card is like, oh, you Filipino? And like we just get into this thing like, you're Filipino, I'm Filipino, cool, and then we just have this Filipino off, and so.
But I think that's important as we think of like the umbrella. It's we have to be okay with all the things that we bring into the space. We have to respect all the differences and maybe the flaws and the issues that come from those different communities. And as we come together, um, because there's going to have to be a lot of togetherness, especially for the advancement that I envision. Is going to require activation from everyone. Although there are people who want to kind of liberate that way, I do believe, not in a kumbaya way by any means, but just the structure of everything that is to be economically, it's going to require everyone to opt in and figure things out and move forward. Any responses to that kind of ideology?
So when you were talking about like getting mistaken for something, Sammy, you know, my whole, because we went to college and stuff and the little jokes that we had. But I
Problematic
actually, yeah, the
behavior
problematic jokes.
of the 2000s.
Well, right. Well, here's the thing. So I get mistaken for things and I actually don't like it. And the reason I don't like it is because it's used as a weapon. So like, you know, I thought it was cool because, you know, I have identity issues. I'm just gonna throw it out there. But like, I thought it was cool when like, you know, Ethiopians would be like, oh, are you Ethiopian? Or like, you know, random Dominicans would be like, you must be Dominican. And I'm just like, no, you know, and I thought it was cool at first. But then, you know, sometimes I would get into these weird like back and forths with people telling them what I'm not. And like, they're like, no, you must be because you're nice, you know, or you must be because your hair is nice, you know, and it started making me think like, oh, is it not okay to like be a Black American? Like I have to be something else. And so like you know, and I've said this to you before, I openly don't talk about being mixed or multicultural because I don't want that to be attributed as to why I'm a certain way, you know, because people tend to rely on the other than being Black as the reason why I'm well spoken, or you know, and it just like it's always bothered me. I was flattered, but it was always like a weird like, oh, that's so nice that they thought that way, but why? Like, what is it? You know, what's so bad about just, you know, being a Black American? And this came from white people. Just they're like, oh, Black, whatever. I'm not. It's like people of color, POC. Africans, you know, like people who are from specific countries in Africa. My experience has been mostly with like West Africans. And they would just like openly say things thinking like, oh, you're not like those Black people because you must be from here. and they would openly say it because of the assumption, and it just made me very uncomfortable, and it's very problematic. So it's kind of been nice in a way to live where I'm living now, where people just see me as Black, because I am around more white people than I used to growing up with. And it's been nice, not because they've been nice to me, but just because like, oh, I can just be Black and like be left alone instead of people like trying to convince me otherwise, And like, my father, he really likes Indian food, and my father doesn't code. My father codes like various ethnicities. So when I'm with him, I get it even more. And I remember we went to an Indian restaurant, and my dad doesn't like talking to people, so I have to order for him. And so I ordered the food for him, and the server was like, yes, of course you would like paneer. And I'm like, okay, like whatever. And I just look at my dad, my dad doesn't discuss race at all, which can be, it's been problematic a little bit for me just with identity issues. And he finally just looked at me, he said, yeah, I get that a lot. When I was younger, people thought I was like Mexican, and now that I'm older, people think that I'm like, from Bangladesh or from India or something. So he probably just assumed, oh, look at your father, And I had a guy like argue with me, tell me, no, your father's must be Indian, your father's Indian, so you are. And it was like trying to, again, like remove the Blackness from it. And so that's where I think it's problematic. It no longer becomes like, oh, you just think I'm a cool person and you wish I was like part of your crew. It's like, no, you like me and you wish I'm not Black. Like you hope that I'm not someone undesirable. So that's what I'm gonna say about that. And it's the same thing with my son, the way he looks. They're like, oh, is he this? And I just like don't respond most of the time because, when you're a mom, you can be mean and not care about what anyone else says. At least that's what I do. I use it as an excuse to just be like, yeah, whatever, Yeah.
We're not going to apply that to all moms, but do you, Naeema, be mean in public?
I use it as an excuse.
So not wanting to be othered or like congratulated for not being completely 100% Black, whatever that means. But also I want to kind of make sure that people stop themselves with their reactions to the wrong, I guess, whatever someone assigns you country-wise, because it might be perceived like you do not want to be considered that country. So just be careful the way that, okay, I'm not Mexican, not because there's anything wrong with being Mexican. I am just not of Mexican descent. I am. So anyone else have any thoughts on kind of identity?
Sammy, I think it's sort of nice because a lot of what I'm hearing anyway, and maybe it's just because all of us here have similar experiences somewhat, but we all are just trying to get included somewhere. And so this person of color thing, what it does is it gives us a place where we feel like we're in the majority. I think that's what I see, and that's been my experience. Even you and I in the office, as much as I joked about it, it did feel a little like, okay, cool, it's not an all-white office. I've got somebody that's in my camp, it didn't.
And this is the CEO speaking. This is the boss speaking.
Because I've always struggled with everybody, you're white, you're white, you're white. It's like I'm not white, and I have fierce pride and respect for my culture and for my family and for my heritage. For the whole ethnicity that I grew up with, I'm fiercely protective of it. And so I have the opposite of it when people are like, oh yeah, you're white. Why don't you just say you're white? It's like, well, because that's not what I identify with. And so I'm very protective of myself. And I grew up with mainly Latinos and Blacks. That's where I grew up. I mean, I just didn't grow up with a whole lot of white people. And so, but I love to see that we're all trying to be inclusive. I think that's what's the most important thing, particularly from the Ashe Academy standpoint, is we're trying to raise up opportunity for all kids of color, however it is that they look. How you look is not always indicative of the opportunities you have because of maybe the way you're being raised or your family background or financial means or what have you. So for me, I like to subscribe to let's be as inclusive as we can to support and rise up all those kids, however they identify. And they may be blonde hair, blue eyed, but they're actually Cuban or whatever the case might be. And so they don't have the same opportunity as, you know, maybe your quintessential white American kid growing up in Thousand Oaks, right? So for me, I just appreciate all of us trying to buy in to include as many as possible because it's only helping, right? I mean, ultimately, we're not looking to say from the other standpoint, well, we're not going to include that student of color at Ashe Academy because they're blonde hair and blue eyed. Well, that's not right either, right? We're trying to provide opportunity, or you're trying to provide opportunity, whatever the skin color. I think it's more maybe about broadening career and education for them as a whole, not simply because, okay, I only want to do it because you're really brown or you're very black, or well, where in the shade spectrum are we stopping there? You know, so I think it's a scary thing to point to shade because where do you start? And which I suppose is the reason for this podcast. But I'll end by telling you I applaud your efforts, and that's why I'm sending folks your way, because I think it's the place to go. And I think it's growing up, our family was the first bilingual college in the country. So we believe education is really the way out. And the way for opportunity for, again, people of color. So
we appreciate that. We appreciate you sending people our way, especially during this time. Now, a little bit controversial question. Does anyone ever feel like the togetherness is a little forced? They want to speak on it. Like it's not all kumbaya. We are kind of forced to be on this under this umbrella. And everything is not going well all the time.
Well, I guess, so I was nodding and then I realized, wait, maybe, so can you like give an example of what you mean exactly?
So with all the differences, and you know, just because I am Black, anti-Blackness is kind of the greatest example. As we are under this umbrella, it kind of circles back to that opting into the community. Like, what are the guidelines to being in this community? One of the things that we got to talk about is anti-Blackness. Like, that's not allowed. So, are people being removed from the community? And if they aren't, how do we deal with this togetherness if there are still some, you know, issues amongst ourselves that we need to sort out?
So I feel like I'm talking a lot, but
No,
I'm
you're not.
okay.
Go for
I'm
it.
gonna claim space. So I feel like, so I'm part of a collective in Chicago, as I've told you before, a nonprofit that focuses on uplifting, you know, self-identified women of color in filmmaking, right? Because we need a seat at the table, but there's always this whole, oh, you don't have the skills, but yes, we do. So here we are, right?
What's the name of it?
Okay. It's called Mescala Media Collective. We were founded in 2017. Like when I first moved out here, I like found this like informal group, and now it's grown to like over 500 members across Chicagoland.
Nice.
So if you're looking for media stuff, just a little plug, you know, just buy, and you're looking for stuff in the Midwest, just, you know.
Absolutely.
But I say that to say, because I found a community there where it's like, everyone who identifies as a woman of color, we have like the same mindset of like, we want to uplift each other, we want to help each other, we want to make space. And people do branch out into like, you know, Asian American focus, you know, Black focus, or, you know, Middle Eastern, Arab, like everyone has their sections for whenever it's appropriate, and no one's upset about it. At least that's the impression I get. But I will say, in terms of talking to your own groups, you know, being, you know, strongly identifying with the Black community is actually where I find some friction, because there's issues of anti-Blackness in our own communities where we deal with like respectability politics, like, oh, you should present yourself this way so that, you know, you don't get shot or something like that, you know. But it's not funny, but like that's basically how people can frame it, especially I feel like some of the older generation. And it's not a dig, it's a protection reason. They feel like if you could just be this way so that you can stay safe and be allowed to be a person, you know, please act this way. So I'm not like knocking it, I just, obviously it doesn't work, right? There's also like sexism you know, within our own community and it's like very specific things that we need to unpack.
Like misogynoir, like
right.
specific to our.
Right, exactly. Where it's like, you know, uplift the Black man, but the Black man can beat you, you know? And I know that's across different cultures, but I'm just speaking to the people that I align with, which is Black Americans. So I know this is not exclusive to Black people. There's also, you know, there's also like, you know, different ways that Black people, at least in our communities, I feel, divide themselves in terms of what is Blackness. I think that this idea of Blackness is still something that is being worked on, right? So like, you know, if you don't speak a certain way, like I remember when I went to junior high school, the first thing this girl said to me was, "You talk light." And I did not know what that meant, but I knew it was bad because of how she said it. So I, at the time, was like, oh, well, I'm living on Central Park West. So I'm living around white people for the first time exclusively. So I'll just say, oh, it's because I live in Central Park West. And like, that's literally what I said to her. And she's like, oh, okay. Like, it was an acceptable excuse. Like, I will never forget that because it was like a very strange thing for me to like do and like pick up on and for someone to say to me. And I was thinking like, oh, I was so used to, you know, just being how I was being and still, you know, seeing myself as Black as far as I knew. But apparently there are rules here that I have to follow. And I find that it's, you know, I've said this before, all skin folk and kin folk, right? Which is like,
I'm glad you said that. I'm so glad you said that.
It's not a monolithic experience to be Black, right? Mm-hmm. And so these expectations that we have on each other to define Blackness is actually what's problematic for me and something that I actively talk to, not really in open forums. I try and do it very like targeted because I don't want people to feel attacked. And I know where it comes from. It comes from places of trauma. It comes from places of hurt, things that need to be addressed that I'm also not equipped to, you know, address all on my own. So I try, if I see it in individuals that I know personally, to like talk through it because I really want this not to be a thing. Like when skateboarding wasn't cool when I was a kid, or liking anime, or like, you know, just someone said to me, "You read too much, you're not in the streets." And I was just like, where else am I supposed to be? Like, I just, you know, and suddenly I'm not Black anymore, or I'm not a person of color because I read Judy Blume books. Like, no, that's not accurate at all. So that's where I think it's not kumbaya. Like, I feel like within the Black community, and I say this in mixed company, so it like feels a little weird, but it needs to be discussed and it needs to be addressed. Like, let people, you want white people to like, you know, white people or white supremacy to see you as people, then you need to treat yourselves in that way and treat your own, you know, constituents in the same manner so that they can be free to be how they are. You can't expect everyone to treat you that way if you don't even see yourself that way. And there's a lot to unpack there. And there's a lot more to say there, but I'll stop.
Yeah, I was gonna say, wait, that could easily bleed into victim blaming if we went a little bit further with like, if you were to act, because then it turns into respectability politics once again, without, while you're trying to avoid it, there is some type of way that you circle right back to it. So
right.
There's a lot of dualities here.
Yeah, there's just a lot, and I just feel like I actively, and I'll just say this last thing about this, I don't actively think about white people when I do things. And that could be a result of not having grown up around white people as much. So I think about people of color or BIPOC when I'm when I'm doing things because that's who I was around. So honestly, I didn't grow up with like thinking about, oh, this white person's not gonna like me because they saw me do something. Like it was not even in the front of my mind. It's really not now either. I just want to be left alone, essentially. Like, if you're racist, stay away from me. Like, you don't need to be around me. Don't actively bother me. Like, leave me alone. I feel that way about people in general, but specifically when it comes to racism, you racist, stay over there. I'm minding my business, mind yours. I don't need Karen or whoever like saying anything. Like, just leave me alone. But there's also like, you know, I think about like Black people, and I want Black people to be okay with me. And there are times where I've encountered them like reacting a certain way, and I have the utmost patience for it because I understand that it's complicated. So I try not to personalize it, but I do think it needs to be addressed and unpacked before I can feel like everything is kumbaya and we're all cool and everything. Because in that sense, I do not feel all cool. And it's easier to like be cool with other people at this point than it is for problematic people in my own like ethnicity, I guess.
Now, is that because we don't talk about everything in mixed company and in the umbrella of POC? Like, there's certain things we usually, some of the things we just discussed would not be in a room full of multicultural people. This is usually us talking to one another. It's a safe space of, okay, if I voice this like internal or intraracial um, anti-blackness, you're not going to judge me for saying it. Like, I've had a history with my own people and things have not always gone right. I'm not going to judge you if you vocalize this, but if you say it around everyone and on a podcast, it will be released nationally. It hits a little different that way. So would you say that's because you wouldn't actually be speaking to that? It's okay to be with the collective instead of.
So I'm comfortable speaking about this in mixed company, but it depends because, so as a filmmaker, I think about audience a lot, right? Like I'm always thinking about like, who is this reaching? And some things are not for everybody, and that's okay. Like I have a friend who's from India and makes documentary films, and I don't understand all the references to the stuff that I don't see the same things, and I'm fine with that. I don't demand answers or use that even as like the epitome of representation for India. I recognize that that is her lens and that is where she's coming from, and I don't try and assign it to everybody. And I think that for me, it gets complicated when people take like, this one Black person said something that I have been thinking, so therefore it is okay. Like, saying like, oh, my Black friend said, or like my Asian friend said it's okay. Like that kind of thing. That's what I like to avoid and why I don't like speaking in mixed company, unless people who are in a group where we're having a discussion where there's time to deconstruct things and like really, talk through things, even if it's not in agreement. We're activated in some level to where we can understand that, again, all skin folk and kinfolk, people are not a monolith, things like that. So that's why I'm comfortable about speaking to it now. I was anxious a little bit, but now I see that we're all okay. So that's why I'm like talking probably a little more and a little faster, a little more with the vernacular and New York accent and all that stuff, because I'm getting a little more comfortable.
And that is the point of these conversations. I want people to be open to share. My intention is that we're going to learn a little bit more about each other through these discussions. And we don't all have to agree, but so I'm like, does anybody disagree? Does anyone have a different perspective? Because we need to get it out there and then discuss, and then maybe we don't agree on that, but at least we spoke about it. So yeah, anyone else have anything to kind of the differences in the kumbaya situation and maybe some frustrations with us all coming together?
So I think like, a lot of sort of newcomers to the whole POC label, oftentimes the first ones to be like, oh, great. So it's this party where we're all like having fun and everything's great. And I tried to remind people like, no, like the point of adopting this label is that you are essentially putting on this little hard hat. And you're like, okay, I know that there needs to be work in order to get to that place where we can even think about having a kumbaya moment. Because I mean, I know that we are far from that. I mean, not only just thinking about how long it takes to eradicate or break down, white supremacy, which is something that's hundreds and hundreds of years in the making. So it's like, I don't think that within the next 5, 10, 20 years, we're even going to get there. So I think I just try to communicate to people that, if you're interested in trying to build this unity, you have to understand how much of a lack of unity there is right now, and how much you need to invest in understanding why certain communities are having these rifts. Because I think another thing is, a lot of people of color understand the dynamics between people of color versus white people, but we don't often talk about those nuances within our own communities, not only just between Asian and Black and Indigenous communities, but even within Asian communities, or even within that specific one, like, for example, talking about Filipinos, like, do all Filipinos operate on that same spectrum? What happens when we take into consideration queer identities and disability and all these different things? So, the kumbaya moment, I don't think will ever happen, and I don't think that we should ever try to be thinking about that moment, because I feel like that puts in some people's minds a date when this thing's going to happen, as if like, all right, we can do enough and then we're going to get to that moment and everything's great. But there is always going to be marginalized voices. There is always going to be people who haven't been included into the fold. And I think the important thing is to recognize that, like, we need to do something. If you have an interest at all in trying to get to that kumbaya moment, or at least in improving the unity within our communities, we have to be able to recognize that everything isn't all right.
That's like the post-racial society, like, oh yeah, one thing happened, so now like racism is over.
Yeah, seriously, like when people, it's like during election season when people think, oh man, we're gonna elect this president and like Trump's gone, racism's gone, sweet. I'm like, I think we have a couple hundred more years left of work. So
isn't that kind of daunting though? Like thinking of like
it is very
I have to be an optimist in the work that I'm doing. Otherwise, you just stop and you're like, well, if I can't make any headway, then why do it at all? Nihilism. Just I can't do anything, so just don't do anything at all. But isn't it kind of like it might be the reality, and if it's centuries before things actually get to a place that we are imagining.
I think like as much as I'm like, sometimes I think about like just white people in general, like, man, how are we ever gonna get past this final boss? And it's like, I think I sort of look at it as a relay race. And I think as long as you can recognize that when it is your time to hold the baton, you need to run as fast and as hard as you can for as long as you can. And when your time is up, you pass it on to the next person. And I think a lot of times there are people who are in this space who want to be like, oh, I'm going to be the next figure. I'm going to be the new MLK, blah, blah, blah. But I think like even those figures knew that, like, I doubt MLK was like, I'm going to be the god of this whole system. Like, everyone who is in the movement recognizes that they are just one node within this long journey. And I think if people recognize that, we are all in this together and we all have to sort of pass the baton, uplift each other, and sort of create that space, hopefully we'll get there.
I love that idea of there's like the obligation that comes with claiming it, like the work that then needs to be done when stepping into that space. And I think you're speaking to something that scares me for the kumbaya moments, because then it's like we're straddling the fence to all lives matter, y'all. You're just straddling that motherfucker. Like, look, we're all good. Like, no, stop. And it does make me nervous, because like even this morning, like I'm seeing something on Twitter, and this woman's like, don't call me Karen because that's racially insensitive to white women of color. And I was like, this is so oxymoronic. I don't even know where to start. I was like, so there's a new thing, which is white women of color.
I think that was a troll, because I think I sent that to Naeema. I actually.
Whatever it is, it shouldn't be.
I just remembered that tweet. I found out it's like a troll account.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Because I was scared. I was like, what is going on?
So that
I
was
do my research. I apologize for putting it out there.
No, funny enough, that was going to be a topic. And before I found out it was a troll, I was going to say, is it a thing to be a white person of color? Like, does that exist?
No, never.
I don't know.
That's what I mean about the oppression Olympics. It's like, yeah. Talking again, but like, as a woman, right? You already have like issues you have to deal with, right? And I said Karen, and I also realized like maybe I shouldn't have said that, because I still have to like deconstruct that term. And it's not that I think it's racist or anything, it's just that I think it's used toward like white women or women in general as like a I don't know how great that is as a woman, like just being like, oh, Karens, because I'm used to seeing women's dismissal in general of their feelings. So I think it's used very loosely. So I'll say that. But women, white women, right? If you're a white woman, you already have some issues that you're coming up against. So I feel like it's weird to like, even though it's a troll account, to like co-opt that like woman of color so you can add oppressions that are like not there, you know? And I feel like that happens a lot with other movements, but anyway.
We're gonna verify if it's a troll account because I wasn't gonna bring it up just because
I'm sorry.
It's like, wait a minute, I don't know if this is real, and I didn't want to fall down the Twitter rabbit hole because I've spent hours accidentally going to a thread and then keep scrolling and find something else. But yeah.
So Sammy, I have a question for you.
Sure.
You're interacting with these students, and I'm curious if you see any difference in the way all of us here on your podcast are reacting to your questions and how the students are, because you know, they're so young and they're growing up in this, you know, really strange time right now, particularly if you're looking at high school students. Can you comment on that? Do you see differences in how they think and speak and relate to this whole concept of being of color or not of color, or?
Gen Z are very interesting. I'm not sure where they stand. I feel like they're a lot more savvy on the terminology that we're discussing, just because they're a lot more exposed to. Us millennials, we're kind of growing up in college in the thick of when Twitter became a thing. Instagram is post-college for me, but still, like, all of these you know, platforms to access all this information, even when Tumblr was a huge thing, a lot of the called it Tumblr sociology, where you could just, you know, study anything, because that's a lot of these terms actually were coined there, outside of already being on Golden Girls 30 years ago, but let's not talk about that. But no, like, some of the language that we have given space to and created hashtags have existed on these platforms that Z has always grown up with. Like, there was a time when Facebook did not exist. I remember these days. MySpace did not exist at one point. Like, I remember not having social media and not always being on a cell phone. There are some intrinsic differences between those generations. And then identity is a lot easier for them to vocalize because they just have access to the language. So a lot of things identity-wise aren't new to them. They're just, okay, like, this is exactly what I feel, so I'm able to identify with that, and I can vocalize that. So I'm excited to learn from them and kind of reflect my own identity with it, because all the multiple things are going on. Kind of like the way I speak, where I grew up, the kind of work that I want to do, going into the arts and STEM and kind of embodying that all in myself. There's a lot going on there, and being a token at that, like, I exist in spaces where I'm the only Black person, and kind of funny how Naeema and I became friends. It was like, I was like, did we like hit it off because we were kind of like meeting the same like token, like you might be tokenized within your community. But like, I am used to being the only one thing in these different spaces. So it's interesting for me to meet kids who may not have that same experience, or kids who are, you know, completely like me, where you might be living in the suburbs, but your parents are not rich, and that's a very like, on paper it would seem, oh, Thousand Oaks, like, you're rich. You're like, no, no. So, but all of these layers, I'm excited to kind of explore with Gen Z, just because I feel like they are a lot more established than I was back in 16, 17, 18. Yeah, and yeah, all of what these identities mean, we're kind of expanding the horizons there. So I'm excited to learn.
I also have a question,
Sure.
piggybacking off of Gisela.
This is Q&A.
Well, because I was thinking when you
it.
said like, oh, how did you and I meet? So I remember, first of all, but I'm not going to get into details. But one of the things that you and I did was team up because we were in competition with each other about something. Do you remember? Like, we were
Is this
trying
French
to
class? Or is this
No,
after?
I didn't speak to
back-
you in French.
Okay, okay. Because we did team up in French.
We did, yes, but that was when I was like still being awkward and like not speaking to people because that's what I do. What I really meant was when we were both applying for the BFA program.
Mm-hmm.
So we were in that class together and we discovered we both were trying to be filmmakers or like get into the BFA program. And instead of like, I guess you approached me as like, can we help each other with our applications? And so I'm bringing this up because you have young people, you have people of color or children of color who may be like, there's only but so much space for me. Like, is there like that, I guess, like, are there plans for that message of being like, no, there's space for everyone so that we're not in competition? Because you and I were like jokingly, haha, I'm gonna beat you. But at the end of the day, you and I always teamed up on things to like make, you know, like we used each other's talents to be like, I'm better than you, but also can you cast my short film? Like, you know, so yeah, so out of curiosity, like building some sort of structure or support to like let young people know that there is space for them, because that's what I think of. Like we, you know, you don't need to teach them to be like, you can only have this opportunity and that means no one else can have it, you know, and so then it's not, you're not unifying, you know, like getting it in early or young enough to be like, there's space for you, there's plenty of opportunity for you. If this isn't the one, there's another one for you. Like there's plenty, and just like pushing it out there.
Absolutely, and I thank you so much for asking that because it's super important. Even when I mention umbrellas like the arts or STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math, there's a lot that goes into that. So then it kind of gets lost. Like that's just an umbrella. What does that actually mean? So our work is really exposing all the students of color and parents of color. Parental engagement is huge because of that support system for them. Going into these fields and also exploring kind of degrees that might not be 4-year degrees, making sure that they know that there are opportunities there. So yeah, we definitely have a lot of work ahead of us to kind of explore that. But I exactly, that's the point. There's not a limited number of spaces. And the way that I've been tokenized, there is so much more room for you guys to come in there, and I want to see more of us there working together. I'm working in a pretty diverse company now, but there's a lot more room for a lot more of us to take up space in these leadership positions, and in regular positions. Like we are aspiring scholars at the helm of excellence, but I kind of want to redefine excellence as not being this thing like we always have to be at the top of our game. Like you always have to finish your degree in 4 years. Like no, you could be a regular, you could get those B's and get those degrees. Like I don't want to put all this burden on you. You're already trying to break into these industries. You do not need to be the best. We need to provide you with opportunities for you to just be able to do it. So that speaks much more to the access because it's hard. Like I have always had this impression that I do have to be the best. And it's not even like coming from my parents or anything, or like how I was raised. It's been something in me that like, okay, always got to be on. So a lot of unlearning there and unpacking and kind of relieving a lot of that, where you're not always just 15,000 things going because you always have to be. But I like to learn, so that's another issue. So I'm a lifelong learner. So any other questions? I love these questions. I get to explain a lot more of what we plan to do and what we're doing now. You guys are good? Any other questions as to what a person of color is? We're kind of clear on that.
I don't think we're clear on it, but I think that we have a conversation going. I
We definitely talked about it.
yeah, yeah.
It was definitely talked
That
about.
is such an excellent point. That is an excellent. I feel like there is so much to discuss identity-wise there that it cannot be handled in one conversation. I think it's something that we need to constantly be talking about and nurturing. And that's the whole point of a community. The opt-in, you have to constantly be in communication with each other and checking in and kind of checking in on what the parameters of that safe space is so that we can all work together. Awesome.
Well said.
On that note, I just thank you guys, each of you, for joining us for another episode of the Ashe Academy's Inspire, Uplift, Engage podcast. Everyone have a good one.
Thank
Nice
you
to
for
meet you all.
having us.
Thank
Nice
you.
to
Yeah.
meet you
Thank you.
guys.
Nice to
Sorry
meet
for
you all.
using
Meet
that
you
word.
guys.
No problem. All right, bye.
Bye, y'all.